What better way to end a month of Zelda spin-offs than with the biggest Zelda spin-off of all time? That's right, today we're going to be talking about what is the most well-known of the Zelda spin-offs, the Hyrule Warriors games. I actually enjoy both of these games quite a bit, and I think that their strengths and weaknesses complete each other as titles. You'll see what I mean as I discuss them in more detail. Let's start with the first Hyrule Warriors game, which is, well, Hyrule Warriors. I remember when this thing first came out, it was pretty crazy. My kid brain had thought it only possible for Mario to get these huge crossover events, but here was this insane time travel story about Zelda characters playing out right in front of my eyes. I had never played a Dynasty Warriors game before, so the gameplay of this game was mechanically fascinating to me on my first go-through. You could just beat up a ton of people at the same time? Years later, it's still a ton of fun. It's probably one of the few reasons to own a Wii U. Oh wait, it's on the 3DS and the Switch. Never mind. Apparently, Hyrule Warriors was made because Team Ninja wanted to make a Warriors game based on a Nintendo franchise, and they just really like Zelda. I can't really blame them. I mean, I also really like Zelda, but I do want to see the alternate timeline where Kirby Warriors was the result of that instead. Eiji Aonuma, the guy who runs the Zelda series, agreed to this because he, much like myself, wants to see the Zelda series break more and more from its traditional roots. Does this mean more spin-offs in the future? I hope so. Stagnation is a huge problem with Zelda right now. Nintendo was apparently quite confident in Koei Tecmo's ability to deliver the game, which is surprising because other studios developing Zelda games is not a science with a successful history behind it. Throughout the game's release cycle, tons of new playable characters were unveiled like Fi and Zant and Girahim and Princess Ruto and Ganondorf, and there are just so many playable characters in this game. That's one of the biggest strengths of the first Hyrule Warriors. It really brought together one of the most compelling playable rosters of Zelda characters that I've ever seen. One of the characters designed for this was a female Link, but she ended up getting scrapped. However, after huge levels of fan demand, she was eventually added into the 3DS port of the game as Linkle, and she also makes an appearance in the Switch version as well, which proves that sometimes fan requests do come true. According to Aonuma, Hyrule Warriors is canon-ish. It's set in an alternate dimension within its own timeline, but that dimension is part of the greater Zelda multiverse. I'm not entirely sure what to make of that, but I don't really care because I think the Zelda connected canon is a dumb idea anyway. Hyrule Warriors does have a batshit insane plot that is worth talking about. I mean, I don't think it's a particularly great plot, but it's really fun for what it is. Basically, there's this lady named Sia who gets really into Link. Like, she has a huge crush on him. So what does she do? Try to conquer the world with her friends and make Link her boyfriend. This is one of my favorite villain motivations in the entire Zelda franchise. Most Zelda villains want to rule the world or destroy it, but she just wants to go out with a guy she likes and goes way too far. It's a bit endearing and incredibly humorous that she went to these lengths. I'm claiming her for the BBD community because I can relate. Anyway, this is all an excuse to make it so characters from every Zelda title show up, which is super cool to see. I love having all of them here. It's a huge crossover event. Everyone gets acknowledged, unless you're from a Capcom-developed title like Vadi. Then you're screwed. Myron from Link's Awakening, a character we've never even seen fight, is playable, and hell, even Tingle gets a slot. The King of Red Lions, the fucking boat from the Wind Waker, is playable here. Something I really don't like is how the plot gets usurped by Ganon in the third act. Yeah, that's right, Ganon shows up to make everything about him again. Sia stops being the villain because that pig guy always has to be the last boss for some reason. It's really lame how often Zelda games do this. There's only one instance where I think it really works, and I'll talk about it when I talk about that game, but for the most part it's just really stupid and incredibly disappointing every time Ganon shows up to be the final boss of a Zelda game out of nowhere, whether it be in a game by Koei Tecmo or Four Swords Adventures. There were a few other stories added in the 3DS port, like Linkle becoming a hero in her own right, or the Great Sea time period invading current Hyrule just to justify the new characters that were added into the mix with the 3DS version. I mean, it's whatever. I generally dislike artificial extensions to stories, and these feel very artificial. It's almost like a new game entirely. Granted, that's also how I feel about Ganon's interruption in the main story as well. Nobody wants this video to hear my thoughts on the plot of the first Hyrule Warriors game, though. That's not why anybody plays the first Hyrule Warriors game. They play it for the gameplay. And let me just say, it's a lot of fun. Every character has their own combos and playstyles, which is further varied by unique weapon choices that several characters have. I particularly love Zant. I mean, I already love Zant in his home game, but here he has an insanely fun style of gameplay where you run around and slap things with scimitars, and when he gets hurt, he literally says ouchie. Zant is such a great character, but I'll go more into that another day. The point is that he is perfectly captured in this game, and every character has that amount of detail here. Another thing I really like about this game is that the gameplay never really seems to get old. Like if you're bored with one character and one weapon type of theirs, you can just switch to another weapon type or another character and play something totally different. Link using a sword and shield is a lot different than Link using the spinner from Twilight Princess. They all play so differently that they feel like they could be the main characters of their own games. It's really cool. The biggest problem with this game's gameplay, I think, is the co-op play. I mean, it's entirely optional, so you can just completely ignore it like I do, but it's really subpar, especially since one player has to use the Wii U gamepad, and the screen on that is not very good. I think the further ports improve the co-op by simply not being on the Wii U though, so that's nice. That's Hyrule Warriors, an insane fan service game that has way too much cool Zelda shit in it in one place. The combat is excitingly fluid and the story, while not much in terms of depth, is surprisingly fun and cute. I really like this game, in spite of the fact that many people seem to think it's totally mindless. I will say that you should never try to 100% complete this game though. It's a nightmare that will ruin your life. Over 1,000 hours of content await you. Do not do it. You will become mindless by the end of it. Now let's get to the part of the video you probably really wanted to hear my opinions on. That is Age of Calamity, the pseudo-prequel to Breath of the Wild. Now, cards on the table here, I think that Age of Calamity is a fantastic game, and the story is the best part of it. Yes, I even like the conclusion to that story, which I know is incredibly contentious for some reason. Age of Calamity was originally developed because Aonuma wanted to have a game that showed the events of the Great Calamity, the cataclysm from before Breath of the Wild, play out, which is already a great idea on its own. However, an even greater idea that he had was to get Koei Tecmo to do the game because he felt the battles of the Great Calamity would be best suited for a Warriors-style game. I'm incredibly grateful that Koei Tecmo was willing to make another one of these bad boys because this is an incredibly polished experience. The interesting thing about Age of Calamity is that it's a lot closer to the main Zelda timeline. It takes place 100 years before Breath of the Wild in an alternate timeline, but that timeline has direct ramifications on the main Breath of the Wild timeline. Or at least I hope it will, because the ending with the champions returning to their own time seemed to imply that. Oh right, I should probably tell you about some basic stuff from Breath of the Wild before getting into this. Basically, in Breath of the Wild, 100 years before the events of the game, there was a great cataclysmic event known as the Calamity, which was brought on by none other than Ganon himself in a state of pure malice. There were 4 champions then who tried to fight it off, and all of them died in the process. 100 years later, there's another 4 champions as well. If Zelda had been able to awaken her light powers earlier, the Calamity possibly could have been prevented, but she wasn't able to. Link and Zelda are then put into some kind of stasis for the next century. All clear? Good. Age of Calamity is a story about what happened before and during the Calamity, and let me tell you, it's one of my favorite Zelda stories. It's got character interactions up the wazoo. The champions from Breath of the Wild felt like barely people in that game, with only a few cutscenes to characterize them, but here, they're so full of life. We actually get to play through Zelda's struggles with awakening her powers before the Calamity is upon the people of Hyrule. And of course, the time travel halfway through to help stop the Calamity is genius. We get to see so many cute character interactions because of the time travel, and it provides a satisfying narrative conclusion that's different than what was expected. It's a really bold ending to have, that being one that changes the timeline permanently. I understand it's disappointing for people who wanted to just see how the Calamity played out, but I ultimately think this has more interesting ramifications. I wonder how the new champions will reflect on their time travel escapade in Breath of the Wild 2. It'll be something to look forward to in a game I didn't think I would care about at all. In addition to this, there are so many cool gameplay elements to talk about here. For one, they completely integrated Breath of the Wild's advanced physics engines into the game. You know how electricity affects metal, fire burns stuff, etc, etc. They added all that in, which makes the gameplay even more dynamic than the first Hyrule Warriors game. I love flinging things around with stasis or setting vast swaths of grass on fire. Even the smallest environmental interactions, like putting out a fire with water, feel satisfying and immersive. It helps that the art style perfectly replicates Breath of the Wild's own nice cel-shaded look. Of course, the character situation is the same too. Every single one is unique and has their own combos and gameplay. I particularly like playing as Rivali. You really feel like a Rito flying around the battlefield and flinging arrows at people. Each location you go to in the game can be matched to a location on Breath of the Wild's map. The entire game is this enormous love letter to Breath of the Wild, and I love every second of it. My only real issue with the game is the camera, which gets stuck a lot, but that's whatever. Did I mention this game has a fucking killer soundtrack? This is yet another aspect that I sorely missed from Breath of the Wild. I mean, come on, listen to this. I would literally replay missions in Zora's Domain just to hear that song again. In short, Age of Calamity did something I never would have expected it to do. It made me care about Breath of the Wild. That's spoiling something from a later review, but I am not the biggest fan of Breath of the Wild. I have negative feelings about the lack of character present in the game. That being said, the characters in the world are presented with such life in Age of Calamity. It's really incredible how much they did to make everyone feel like a person. It's not even like we learn that much about them. They just all feel so natural and real interacting with each other. I think Age of Calamity does exactly what a prequel should. It made me care more about what happens in the original work. And all of this is on top of the game's wonderful implementations of Breath of the Wild's own mechanics, art style, and gameplay systems, which fuse naturally into the Warriors gameplay formula. And that's what I mean when I say that these two Warriors games have different strengths and weaknesses that meet each other. While Hyrule Warriors is a fun romp through loads and loads of references to classic Zelda games, there's no real substance to the story there. It's fun and cute, but there aren't any characters I'd say that really stick out to me besides Sia. And even though Age of Calamity has such a rich story and characters, the Breath of the Wild fan service doesn't really appeal to me because it's not a game that I really like. However, the fact that the game made me care about Breath of the Wild in any capacity at all is an incredible feat. Overall, I think they're both more than worthwhile experiences, and I'd recommend either to anyone any day. You might think they'll get boring after more than a few hours, but trust me, not much beats some good old fluid combat in the Zelda world. This has been Arcade Everlasting, still putting in their 1000 hours on Hyrule Warriors to 100% it, signing off. Thank you for watching.